I was nervous. This surprised me. Though it had been 10 years since I'd passed through Cregan's doorway, I didn't feel estranged. The place was in my bloodstream, part of my very being. I drank my first pint in here, made my first real friends, lost my virginity to one of its few female clientele, and had 32 dart trophies from its Saturday night tournaments, proudly displayed in an expensive cabinet back in London. Cregan's was my youth, my early manhood, and despite all the places I had been and all the things that I'd seen, I'd never really left the place. I decided that this was a lover's reunion, and I was nervous that Cregan's would have forgotten me, wouldn't recognise the balding, middle-aged man I had become. Or maybe this was just bullshit, and I was just shook up from negotiating those hairpin bins on the mountain road. Steeling myself, I lifted the latch and walked in. It was dark and dingy. Thick threads of cigarette smoke rolled towards the ceiling and far corners like sinister vapours over a secluded marsh. There was a momentary hush when I stepped over the threshold. The clientele let off playing cards and darts, chatting to look towards me. In my mind, this place had always been a place of fun and laughter and companionship. Looking at it now, with my semi-stranger's eyes, it seemed claustrophobic and unfriendly. But only for seconds. Almost immediately, faces relaxed into smiles of recognition. "One of our own! Come in and welcome," Sean Cregan called out from behind the counter. I relaxed, glad I'd found the courage to enter. Walking towards the counter, people called out greetings and acknowledgements. It felt good to be back amongst one's own. There in the corner was Jim Shire, the retired schoolmaster, Paul Collins, the owner of the post office, and Michael Donoghue, the local vet, playing 45 as they had been doing for 30 years or more. George Hayes, Andy Morrison, Frank Dunleavy and Jerry Clancy were throwing darts. Serious portermen these. Every minute away from Cregan's was spent trying to scrape enough money together to return. Despite spending all day working side by side in the farm, Mike Kelly and his son sat together as always, though, not surprisingly, they rarely spoke to each other. As I went by, people turned from greeting me back to whatever they'd been doing or talking about before I came in. The steady hum of barroom chatter rose all around. "You must have had that ace up your arse," I heard Paul Collins remonstrate with Michael Donoghue. I smiled. Those two had been gnawing at each other for what seemed like eternity. "Take that," said Collins, as he thumped a jack of spades on the table. "No sooner calved than licked," Jim Shire responded, placing a king on top of the jack with all the decorum of a whiskey-sozzled ex-schoolmaster. "Well, feck you, you old bastard. You bait me every day in that kip of a school above there, and now you bait me every night in this kip of a pub." I was home all right. "A pint of Guinness, Sean," I said, when I reached the counter. "Good man yourself. You were never keen on the spirits, were you?" "No, Sean, I wasn't." When the creamy head had settled, he passed the pint across to me. "On the house," he said, "for one of our own." "Cheers," I replied. "It's sláinte here," he winked. I turned and sipped, relishing how much softer it felt than that slop they'd serve you in London. I looked around the bar, trying to gather my thoughts. That was another thing about Cregan's. There was fun and companionship to be had, but if a man wanted to be left alone for a while, he would. This was a man's pub and we understood each other. I was reconnecting with my youth and it would require some mental readjusting. I recalled the crappy Irish pub I frequented in London. Well, this was the real thing. "Up yours, London," I inwardly toasted and went to sip my pint again. It was remarkable how little had changed. The tables and chairs were still the same brown wooden tops and black metal supports of 10 years ago. Even the dartboard looked the same. It was showing wear and tear around the middle near the bull, but no more than a decade ago. Over against the far corner was the formica top table where Tom and I had sang a duet about Mary from the Mountain Glen. You know, the smutty version. The legs of the table had collapsed beneath us and we fell in a heap on the floor, splashing our pints of Guinness all over the place. That was the only night that Sean Cregan got mad at us. To hoots and derisory cheers he chucked us out, yanking us by the collar of our coats. We made it around the corner of Bridge Street before collapsing on the street again, this time with laughter. The following weekend we played starring roles in helping the town to win the West Under-21 Hurling Championship. That night we were back in Cregan's again, drinking out of the cup and accepting the plaudits of everyone. Sean allowed us to dance on the counter, and why not? We were young and not as wild as we'd imagined. There were very few youngsters in here now, probably shooting up drugs somewhere. Leaning against Cregan's counter, taking in the stale beer and acrid smoke smells of my formative years, my achievements in London seemed irrelevant. I'd been stupid to wait 10 years before returning. Tom's death was the blow that stopped me in my tracks. Made me think about the things that I could achieve away from here, so I went and did them. But I shouldn't have cut myself off so completely. It had only been to myself that I needed to prove anything. My psyche had suffered too much, and it had tried to tell me, because I couldn't recall a dream from the last 10 years that didn't revolve around me returning here. Did it really matter that I was now an executive director, drove an X5 Jaguar, had the 3-bedroom flat and a gorgeous wife in the Docklands? No one here would give a shit about any of that. They'd only want to know if the real me was inside this middle-aged businessman's body, or had I let that person go too with the physique? Maybe if I could get into a game of cards or start up a chat about hurling or drinking, I could convince them. The door opened and a chilly draft swept in. The temperature had dropped a lot in a few minutes since I'd been outside. I glanced at the entrant and froze, drink halfway to my mouth. Tom Clark stepped into the pub. Tom Clark? Soulmate of my youth. The fishing, shooting, hurling, drinking and womanising we'd done flashed across my inner vision as he turned and looked straight at me. My bestest friend, Tom Clark. Dead. 16 years. Killed in a drunken car crash. I'd helped shoulder the coffin down the aisle and into the graveyard. Had even lowered it into the muddy parallelogram of his grave. Now he was walking towards me as though none of this had happened. Correction. He was towards me despite it having happened. He exuded a musty smell of decay and damp earth. His once handsome features had bashed in from where he'd made contact with the windscreen. His head bulged in an odd place as though someone had opened it and giving its contents a good stir before stitching it down again. His well-groomed hair stretched in lank, dirty black hooks. He smiled. Between his rotten stumps, something furtively scuttled, a beetle or some other insect. "Let's play," he lisped in a soggy voice that was never his. "Let's play," the catchphrase of our youth. And, oh God, something was far worse here than even this. The entire pub had stopped what it was doing and everyone was shuffling towards me, with Tom in the lead, intoning, "Let's play, let's play, let's play." As the clientele of the pub advanced, they began to physically deteriorate. Skin burst, revealing innards I'd only previously seen in biology books. Hairs and fingernails grew and stretched to unnatural lengths. Clothing disintegrated. Some of the people sliding toward me were now completely naked, exposing filthy, rotten flesh, jiggling intestines and gleaming bones. But worse and most pervasive of all was the stench of decomposition. I gagged. All thoughts of good pints of Guinness completely flown from my head. Tears streamed down my face. I hadn't been home for a long time, but there were shops in London where I could buy the local paper. I suddenly started recollecting. Didn't Jim Shire die of a heart attack some years back? Didn't Georgie Hayes have cirrhosis of the liver? Wasn't there something about Mike Kelly shooting his son and then himself? Everyone in here was dead, except it was a hired car. There were always street lights in London. I hadn't driven the mountain road in such a long time. No, it was raining also. The road curved too near the edge. The right front wheel, no grip. I couldn't get it back. Falling, screaming, falling, screaming, stepping into Cregan's act. I was one of our own. Sean Cregan, who died from bowel cancer 9 years before, whispered seductively behind me. His hot, whistling breath ruffling the hairs on my neck. The chant had changed. One of our own. One of our own. One of our own. They closed in, giggling and chanting as they came. Tom's dirty curved nails sank into me, sending frissions of pain through my body. Immediately he was joined by others. I felt myself being pulled and gouged apart. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. With great good humour, my companions stuck to their task, while I tried to scream and prayed to wake up, but I was home, amongst my own, and this time I would never leave.